the most part, this course tonight was to cover a basic toolkit for what you would do around your home. You don't need to go out and buy everything that's on this table. It would cost you a small fortune. What I always said, and George would agree with me, that you tailor it to what you would feel comfortable doing. Good screwdriver set you can't beat to have around the home for most people. That's something that I would say most of you would benefit from. Things like saws and that, how much wood will you be cutting? Will you be working with specialty woodworking where you would need a pull saw? That's something that most people won't unless you're going to do a lot of finishing work. That's what that's for. A drywall saw, as we touched on last time when we did the drywall, and a half-decent handsaw. This is a small version, and they're a laser cut teeth. It's a very good quality saw and would do most of what you will do. If you're going to do any serious building like a deck or something like that, I would say to buy a skill saw. With power tools comes safety factor. Always wear hearing protection. I'm a prime example of someone who didn't wear hearing protection. I have what's called tinnitus, and it's a constant It's one of those things where high-pitched and steady frequency noises cause hearing damage. I suffer from a serious ringing in my ears all the time. It never goes away. And days like today where the weather changes, the volume just goes up in my ears. Totally preventable. Stupidity to not wear those. I was the guy in construction that put your hard hat on, but I'm not going to wear those earmuffs back in the day. Now with the advent of the foam earbuds and that you stick in, perfect for what you need to do with that. Cordless drills. I think we touched on various quality of tools and that. There's many different types now. Something along this line is probably all you would ever need. Get one that's got a keyless chuck. That one's locked. I picked this one off the shelf. The other type are a snap chuck. They're great if you're in the trades and you've got a driver that just locks in like that. But drills for them, the bits are expensive if you have to replace them and that. Something with a chuck, you can always just take and run any of these in there. Don't buy a drill that doesn't have a removable battery. There's lots of them on the market that they used to have that the battery was built into the drill. What happens if you use it and it goes dead on you? You've got to take and wait for the thing it charges. So if you're trying to do a job, buy a drill that comes, a lot of them now come with a second battery. So you'll always put one on the charger and have one in the drill that you're using. That way then you get through your project and you're not having to wait for the tool. Another thing, how much mechanical type tools would you use? Like a flat wrench set and a socket set. A small one is always advantageous. You go to put up a kid swing set, take a tire off your bicycle to take it down, have fixed. Any of those small jobs are going to require some of these tools. You could take the bike, load it all up in your vehicle and take it down to the bicycle repair shop, or if need be, take the rim off with the tire down and have them fix it. Put it back together and away you go. Many of the types of furniture you'll buy nowadays, you can buy in knockdown form, and many of these tools can be used at the same time for assembly of those tools. We touched on the little scraper pry bar. That's something every guy should have and girl in their tools. One of those. That's a vital tool. Richard's bar. You'll find that they're used for way more things than you would ever think possible. A square of some sort. This is a T-square. They're adjustable, so if you're making saw cuts, you can put it in mark for your pencil cut for your cut. They're also used for, you can take it and use it to measure depth on something, where you put this and go up to it and it'll give you the dimension there. It has the angle on it, so if you want to put it 45, it's preset to that. Otherwise, you'll use something like a 2-foot square. Mine's right here. They come in handy if you're doing any kind of construction, like building a deck, picnic table or such. You can probably get away with this, but it's a lot easier laying things out with a larger square. The more contact surface you have on your material, the truer the square is. The smaller the contact surface, the more chance if you get a board that's got a slight wow in it, it can be a little askew when you go to mark for square. So a little bit longer square gives you a more accurate. There again, if you don't plan on doing any of those things, it's not really an advantage to you. I use it for a straight edge with my utility knife to cut things as well. It can be many different things. If you're going to do something like build a shed, if you know how to utilize the measurements on it, you can get your slope for your angles on the roof. 412 pitch roof is 4 inches on one side, 12 on the other, and that gives you the slope of the roof. Squares like this one has the framing tables and that written on them. That's one of the reasons I always bought this one. I have 2 or 3 of them around. I've got some cheaper aluminum ones that scrape the ice off of materials and that on job sites. They're not as accurate as this. This is steel. The aluminum ones have been dropped a few times and maybe isn't 100% true. I've straightened it I don't know how many times. There are tricks to straightening them if you did end up with one that wasn't square. You take a center punch and you just put a center punch mark one way or the other and it opens and closes this. There are tricks to fixing some of those. Utility knife, that's about the standard of the industry now. The blades slip in and out of it. Replacement blades are bought in many different types of packs. I'm sure your husband uses something similar to that, or a knife that has a sliding blade. This here has hook blades for shingles. These are the types of blades that style of knife will fit. And they're double-sided, that you can actually flip the blade. You take this apart, flip it, put it back together, and that. These aren't as common anymore. Most of the guys I know use this style, or there's another one that's a flip type that the blade actually locks. I find these are about the most cost-effective on them right now. You can extend the blade out or back. If you want a new surface for the point, these are designed. They just break off and you've got a new point on there again. Chisel. There's very few times that the average homeowner will use a chisel other than to scrape something, which isn't really what it was designed for, or if you're installing door sets. That's what I use them for the most part. Nail sets. If you're putting casing or baseboard on and you've got a nail that doesn't quite set, these have got different size points that you put on the nail and tap it and drive the nail in so that it's inset in the wood. Ideally, if you're going to do a lot of it, an air nailer is an ideal way because it sets the nails for you. Don't get me wrong though, they don't always set the nail. You'll end up going around and having to put them in. If you're using an air nailer, doing a bunch of casing work and that, before you go to paint them and that, always check and make sure all the nails have set. Sometimes you'll get where the compressor isn't keeping up and doesn't set the nails. You can rent the compressors and nailers. There's companies like CNC, Hertz Rentals, Home Depot. They will actually rent you a gas nailer as well. It uses a butane cartridge that will set nails and that. Now they're making them in an electric version that your battery style for the cordlesses will work as well. And they actually do work quite well, but they're pricey. That's where people in the trades use them.
And it's probably better, like you said, to rent them than to purchase them. Maybe you would not use them that often.
Caulking gun, a good quality one. I spoke on that previously. I like this style because it's rather robust. It's not like the old clicker ones that you find around. Some of them were good quality, but a lot of them you get a tube of caulk or something in it and it's a little cooler out and it's pretty stiff, and you get going on those other, everything bends and twists in your hands and they don't last. A good quality hacksaw is something that I always say to people with a good rigid frame. Some of them don't have a solid enough frame, and you'll find they twist and flex quite easily. This is a real rigid frame. You can tighten up the blade, put a little more tension on it. It's not just a locking adjustment on them. That biggest trick with a hacksaw is to keep the blade taut, keep tension on it, and they'll cut through pretty much anything you're working with other than tile.
So what would you use a hacksaw or
If-
not a handsaw?
If you're working around your home and you've got a door sweep and you want to cut it down, that will do it.
Cuts metal.
Or metal. If you've got the sill on the thresholds that you've got, you can see there's all kinds of copper colored, silver colored. Use it on flooring for transitions from hardwood to vinyl to, they come in random lengths and you can cut it with that. Snips always make a curl on them and they have a tendency to twist and tear on them.
So
Of
that
what-
one's for metal and handsaws for wood.
Yes.
Sometimes you might use a hacksaw for hard plastic.
Yes.
Cutting ABS piping or something, any kind of steel.
Your plumbing pipes, your ABS will be cut with that. Handsaw isn't very functional for it. It has a tendency to clog the teeth. It doesn't clean like wood.
ABS is a hard plastic pipe. We call it ABS. Now, what does ABS mean? Good, we got something they didn't know. Love it.
Been called ABS most of my life. So that scraper that I showed you with the painting, when you get to the exteriors and that, if you're cleaning around for caulking, you can use the hook part of it. If it's on wide surfaces, you can use this flat surface for it. And the little hook piece, that's for pulling nails, little small finish nails in that. You can actually hook it and lift, and it will actually pull small nails.
What is that specific name for that?
This
Yeah.
is just a scraper. I get these ones from the paint store because it's designed with this curve in it for cleaning rollers,
Right.
for cleaning paint out of rollers. But it does have multiple purposes. For the most part, paint stores,
Well, I
and,
saw them at Princess Auto. That's what I'm.
pardon?
I saw them at Princess Auto. I saw them at Princess Auto.
Yes, and you'll find them in pretty much all the lumber yards have a variation of it. There's lots of different designs and shapes of them, but for the most part, this you'll find in the paint section.
If you had a look in Dennis's garage or mine, you'll discover that we probably have 3 or 4 sets of everything you see on this table. And through the years, and I suggest to you that one of the best sources of decent tools are yard sales. I pick up all kinds of stuff. I'll probably have 14 hammers. I have all kinds of stuff that I probably wouldn't make use of, but I discovered, just what Dennis said, I made up complete household toolboxes for my son, all my son-in-laws. They receive a full set of tools from me so that they can look after their house, and I don't have to run over there and change the bloody bulb every time. No, they can do it themselves. But yes, yard sales is a really good source for tools.
That, and I poke around Brandon. I pick up odds and ends. My son and I bought a box of tools for, I think it was $100 3 weeks ago. The guy said a box of tools for $100, and I looked at the picture and there was all kinds of things, and it turned out he was a cable and alarm installer. It wasn't a box, it was one of those large plastic totes. There's probably $1,500 worth of things in the box. I mean, there's a lot of things that I would never use, but my son turned around and put stuff on eBrandon and sold most of the stuff that we didn't use for what we paid for the box for.
But a good tool is a lifetime purchase. It's not something you're going to wear out and buy again next year. It lasts forever.
Anybody know what that is?
What's that binder?
There you go.
Every woman should have one.
For finding the 2x4 in a wall when you're looking to hang a picture. You'll place it along the wall, and as you go along, not sure if this wall has got steel studs or probably does. On our mock-up, we can go by it and I'll show you after. As you come up to it, there's a line of red LEDs that'll progress up. And once it hits the top here at the very edge, it measures the density that's behind it in the wall. And if you go up to both sides, you'll find that the two lines are roughly the 1.5 inches apart. And I always just take my small pencil and just put a little tick on the wall on either side so you can find the center of the stud.
So if you didn't have a stud finder, or is it standard, whatever there is, 16 inches apart?
Standard framing on a lot of old houses was 16 on center, but some were 12. And then the odd one that you would find was somebody who was probably a bit of a Scotsman, and they were 2 foot on center.
Interior walls might end up 2 feet on center, but outside walls really should be, no more than 16.
But even by today's standard, there's still framing out there that's 2 foot on center,
Yep.
and there's also what they call 19.2. It's metric, and if you look on my tape measure, I can show you. (19.2) is a way of them saving one floor joist in a system, because it works out still on your 8 foot centers for the 19.2s, and most of the tapes nowadays have a little diamond or some notation on 19.2. And if you follow along that little diamond portion, you can see that it's and it will work out on your 8 foot.
So all your building material is 4 feet by 8 feet. There's drywall,
see that
plywood. So if
They'll
your
put
studs
the
are
little
set
diamond
up
on there.
16 inch on center,
Yeah,
where the edge of the 2x4, where the plywood comes,
Fine.
or the drywall,
and they'll
always
continue
go
on.
exactly 8
And 8 feet ends up
You don't have to cut it.
right on them. You'll notice there's a diamond right in the black. It was, somebody came up with a system, and span tables were adjusted for 19.2. Span tables in your building code tell you how far something can legally span a distance. So if you up the thickness of the plywood on a floor, you can extend the width of what they span. I've done some that were a truss floor that used 1.25 inch thick plywood. And it's an OSB product, so you can actually have floor joists that are this far apart.
If you live in an older home, you can almost bet that it's been renovated at least once or twice before you got to it. So there's always the unexpected happening in behind the wall. You might say, well, there should be. You found a 2x4, and you say, well, another one should be only 16 inches away. So you measure, and then you put a nail in, and there's nothing there. It does happen during renovations. So you know, that's where the stud finder comes very handy.
The only time it really doesn't do you much good is in lath and plaster walls, because the lath is continuous. There's always wood backing in there. I have run into occasion where the walls in the home were sheeted with 3/8 plywood and then the drywall. I pretty near broke my leg. We were going to do a renovation, and I proceeded to decide I'm just going to kick a hole in the wall to start pulling the drywall. And when I stepped up to it and laid the boots to it, I ended up flat on my back because there was plywood behind it. The north end of Brandon, I've actually renovated and found CPR planking in behind the drywall finish on there. Because years ago, in the north end, the railroad was right next door, and most of the people that worked there carried a few of these planks for boxcars. Boxcars were lined with a 3/4 inch by 12 inch planking, and it sat in huge piles at the rail yards down there. So it wasn't uncommon to find things like that in homes. So an older home, I believe yours is lath and plaster, you could find just about anything in some of them.
My
Including
house-
sawdust in the walls.
Well, sawdust with horsehair. And in the bathroom, when we renovated it, there's a corner beam that goes from the bottom all the way up, and it's 2.5 stories, and it's huge. The electrician came in and said, a hurricane would take this house down, and it goes all
Yeah.
the way up. So, but the guy downstairs, when, I don't know whether he tried to hide from his wife, he made a lot of rooms downstairs in the basement, and he used a lot of the stuff from the CP rail, and my actual ceiling is all from the old carts, food carts.
Yeah.
Food, like like the little boxes,
crate?
apple crates and stuff. So my whole ceiling is nothing but apple crate wood.
Yeah, it wasn't uncommon years ago for them to utilize pretty much anything they could find around. A lot of the older homes in the core area and the north end were prone to things like that. People were pretty thrifty, and it wasn't uncommon to find peculiar framing materials. And I found railroad ties that were quartered and a dormer on a house. You know, I opened it up. You were advised about the WRAP program last time. It's a program that's been around before, and I did some work under that program, and that's what I found in a home. And it was actually creosote-covered railroad ties that they had quartered down. I had Brandon area planning there, and I asked them, how do I fix that? Needless to say, I didn't tear the whole thing apart. I came up with a system that I put inside of it and encapsulated it so that, because the creosote and tars that were in old railroad ties are a carcinogen. So I sealed everything up, framed the roof inside of the roof so as not to disturb it.
When they took the siding, the old wood siding off my house, what it was all cedar,
Yeah,
and that was from the old railway, they said.
yeah. Cedar was used in a lot of siding applications. Cedar lap siding lasts forever.
It looked quite good, actually, when it all came off. I was like, oh my God.
The only problem I find with it is, and Leanne and I spoke about it, their husband and her had done their home and found paint blisters after they had redone the whole home, and it was moisture coming from the inside and passing out through it. It will cause the paint to lift off of those surfaces. So that's why you don't see a lot of cedar lap siding anymore on homes. It's usually things like hardy board, vinyl, metal siding, or something along the lines of stuccos, acrylic finishes that are used in stuccos now. The tools section of things, are there anything that you could think of that you would do that you might need other tools with?
I was wondering, can you cut the boards with a jigsaw?
Pardon?
The drywall with a jigsaw?
You can.
It's very dusty.
It creates a lot of dust. But I mean, if you're comfortable with it, that's fine. I've seen, they make routers right now that, for doing all that use basically a drill bit. And it's a high speed, it just pokes through. And what they do is they run it against the electrical boxes and such. And if you go counterclockwise, the rotation of the bit holds it against the box. I think it's counterclockwise. And it's not actually a drill bit, it looks like a drill bit, but they're designed for the tool. And they only set them out the depth of the drywall so that it just touches the electrical box. When they first came out, electricians hated them because guys would leave the bit sticking out, they would stick it in the box and go around and they'd cut the new wires off with it. So the electrician would come to pull the wires and wire the home, all his wires cut off. So there are different ways of doing it. For your tools, we spoke about the painting. I don't think anybody had any questions about the types of brushes, rollers, or drywall knives that we were. I put them out just so people would see again that those were all still within what I consider homeowners' tools. You know, for doing your own projects and that, it's beneficial to have some of the basic hand tools. There's lots of other tools. A chalk line is a good one to have. It's basically a string with chalk. Reels out, you can snap a line. If you're going to be doing it, don't use black chalk on the walls. It doesn't come off very well. Blue is fairly common. It comes off quite easily. Red is a little tougher, but there are different grades of it. The black is like an iron oxide a lot of the time, and it doesn't come off real well. You'll notice a lot of framers. I used it predominantly for framing houses. It can actually stand a rain even sometimes, and the lines don't come off the floors when you snap them down. For your drywall tools, again, a standard knife is pretty much all you need. Some people use this style of knife for drywall work because the blade is a little more rigid. The black colored blades are a little heavier duty than a standard. There's two different grades of them that they use, and actually they make a knife that uses a blade that's one size larger than this. I have a couple of them around home as well. They're used in more heavier cutting. For the average person, these will do. Tape measure, good quality tape measure, you can't go wrong. I probably got a dozen Stanley tapes around. I found some of the ones that you've got for $2 and $3 at the till. They don't last. And as well, I had a boss one time, he'd give me a chewing out that every time I cut the board, I was a 1/4 inch short. And he says, you don't know how to read a tape. So I took 3 of the guy's tapes, I went like this, and I put his on it. And his tape was 3/4 and mine read 1 inch. Just the very end of it was poor. The rivet had gotten to where it was loose in it. I picked it up, threw it in the bush, and took my spare tape off the dash and give it to him. At least then I found if you're working with somebody else, if they all have the same tape measure, you should be safe. You can buy these in 30, 35 to up to 50 feet now. I find predominantly a 25-foot tape is pretty much all anybody needs, and for the average homeowner, a 16-foot tape is a little smaller in size. 25s and 30s I've used a lot of, but not anything larger. The larger ones have a tendency, when you pull them a long ways out, the springs break internally. If you're going to buy a longer tape, buy a 50-foot inlet winds up. The retractable ones don't work very well, and I think it's a waste of money. They're usually fairly expensive. Always buy a metal tape. The cloth covered tapes aren't really too well for things. Years ago there was a few of them around that you saw. I've got one that's a leather case with it, but it's an actual cloth tape that winds up.
The beauty about tools is that I've come to discover anything I've learned through my 45 years of doing this stuff. There's not a job anywhere in construction that they don't make a tool specifically for that job. The trick is finding the tool. And if you're not sure, if you got yourself a job that you're saying, "Yeah, what's what I should use," when you go to get some help at the Home Depot or wherever you go, tell them what you're doing. You say, "What should I use to scrape this shit off the floor, or to pull that stuff off here, or to get rid of that?" And they'll direct you to the proper tool. Saves you headaches and time and efforts, rather than trying to use a tool that's not designed, like Dennis said earlier. People have chisels, but they never use them for what the chisel designed. They usually end up using scrapers or to pull nails with, and that's just a real shame.
How many people have pulled tiles off of a floor and had a heck of a mess to fix? Home Depot has a machine that actually has it's a wheel that's got scrapers on it for cleaning concrete, or a large orbital disc for doing floors. I've used one on a concrete floor that we took up tile, and it was a horrible mess. Tried scraping the glue and everything. It took hours to do a little patch, and rented that machine and did a room about here to that wall in an hour, cleaned the whole floor, loaded the machine up and took it back. Sometimes just the time you save on a job
Worth the rent.
is worth the rental of a tool for doing some of those things. We'll slide over and we'll do a window now, unless you've got any questions on the tools.
What's a reciprocating saw used for?
Reciprocating saw is every carpenter's friend. If you make a mistake, a reciprocating saw, you can buy blades that are bimetal, that'll cut wood, nails, sheet metal. It's basically a handheld machine that has a blade sticking out of the end. I can pull one off the shelf here and show you. I think there's
Also
one.
known as the Sawzall.
I think there's one right by that cardboard box at the end there, George.
So it's like a handsaw and a hacksaw together?
And it's kind of you can get a hacksaw blade that fits it to cut metal. You can get a diamond blade that cuts sewer pipe.
It just fits in
The
there.
blade sits in and it
Like
goes back and forth. They're
And
a
then
great tool.
cordless. This is a big one. They come smaller than this.
So say even if you needed to take, a little piece off of a board, you weren't quite.
They're not very accurate
Because they don't cut straight.
a lot of the time. And they're only as,
The blade goes like this.
Goes
Well, they
Yeah.
shake like this.
Yeah.
Because that's what I thought, I could just get that, and my brother said, no. you shouldn't
No.
do that." But I was just thinking, what else could it be used for?
you're better off if you're cutting the dimensional lumber with a skill saw and a square. Draw a line.
You can cut pipe, or there's a section that will cut through everything. Right? For example, you have to cut a hole in the wall. You take the saw off.
They're basically
Cuts
designed for
2x4s,
demolition.
Drywall and everything else. It'll cut anything.
And by the way he was wielding that, you can understand why you would need a first aid kit. You'll find anyone that has a sawzall around is more apt to have been in the trades and that. If I made a mistake and put a wall up somewhere and had to cut the nails off the thing, I put an all-purpose blade in and you stick. And a lot of the time you bend the blade the way it shouldn't go sometimes. You can cut nails off plates, you can cut doorways out. If you happen to get where you've been forming some concrete or something, you can't get the lumber out, cut it into sections and pull it out. It's kind of a rough way to cut things.
That's a good way to put it, rough way to put it.
Cuts nails like butter.
The blades you buy for them, don't buy cheap blades if you ever were going to use a sawzall. I always caution people on that because cheap blade will just either jam, bend, or turn black and smoke and pour off of whatever you're trying to cut. Any other questions then on the tools?
If you were to buy an air compressor, what kind of air compressor would you recommend?
For the most part nowadays, there's probably a dozen different companies that sell air compressors of all different kinds. And we can look at one or two of them here. But if you actually look at them, I believe there's only two companies out there that manufacture the actual compressor heads that are in them. There's an oil bath compressor or there's oil-less, which means the machine doesn't have any oil in the system at all. Oil-less are usually cheaper. They aren't very good for a life expectancy if you're going to use them for continual use. All of my compressors are an oil bath compressor, which that one is there. It has a dipstick that you have to check the oil in and that, but they're more designed for continual use. They live longer outside. They're a little harder to start in the winter when it's cold. A lot of the time we used to put them in the truck and let it warm up for a bit and then set it out, and once it's started for the day, it runs fairly frequent and doesn't get stiff. Oilless will run in colder temperatures, but it's harder on them. They don't last as long.
Not all air tools use the same amount of air at the same time. Like a little brad nailer for doing trim around the doors and stuff, doesn't use much air at all. But if you had a nailer that drives spikes, or a nailer that does roofing that Dennis will show you in a second, they use a lot more air, and you would need a bigger compressor.
And the compressors will have a regulator on them. If you are using power actuated tools that use more, you set the compressor up higher, that's 75 to 80 pounds usually. Brad nailers down anywhere as low as 35 to 45, depending on the tool. And there's a regulator on them that has an arrow usually on them. You can turn them up or down.
So, for someone who's going to buy one, the average homeowner wants one, pump up tires, plus to do a construction, and just general house use, what size compressors should they buy?
Something like the little twin tank that we have here that we can look at there.
And they have them like that with a single tank.
Yes, they make them in a smaller version, yeah. I find the little twin tank ones, they'd run a lot less, and I've got one that's probably, I'd like to say 20, 25 years old, and I've never done anything but replace gauges when guys threw lumber in the back of the truck and broke them off. So if you buy a decent one, the ones that I think mine cost me $500 or $600 when I bought it, but nowadays they're not near as expensive. You can buy a couple of $100, I think. Lumber yards will find you a pretty decent small one. And there again, if you watch for a used one around, as long as it's in good working order and everything isn't rattling and loose on it, they'll last a homeowner for a long time.
Some of those compressors there, for example, you can run 2 or 3 tools off that same compressor. You can have 2 nailers going at the same time. That's not something you really need. It's probably a little bit of work. You have one that has one outlet that produces, you can run it up to 100 pounds pressure. You probably run 80% of the stuff you need in your house.
And they're great for pumping up a tire on your car.
Your bike, your car.
A lot better than the one you stick in the lighter and sit there out there shivering for 30 minutes to try and get the tire to blow up. I think everybody's done that. I know I have. I dragged one out of the junk pile out back. I made reference to a renovator window. A renovator window years ago we used to do them this way, where you drilled them. You would put the screw in, fasten it, and there's little plastic caps that I've got a bag of that fits over these. The average person won't notice them in that from a distance, but I don't like this. To me, it doesn't look good. If you buy windows nowadays with a renovator, They come with this, and it snaps on the window. You take your little pry bar and you stick it in the corner here, and you pop this off, and it peels off. And there's a track in here that you can put all of the screws in. And then you just take this and and it pops it right on top of it, and then it covers it. That way, if you've got siding or stucco, you take and run. If it's a stuccoed house, you would have the stucco right up to the window. I use a diamond wheel, or the same wheel they use for cutting hardy board siding, and it's only got a couple of teeth on it. And they're a sharp tooth, and it'll clean stucco and anything along the edge. You would take your old window and set it so that your blade would go just the depth of the brick mold, and then run it around the perimeter of the window so that you can get the old window out. You would then put the new window in, and you'd have a gap to the stucco, and then you just take a colored caulking, something similar to what your stucco is, or white, and run it all the way around the window.
This part here is what Dennis calls the brick mold, right? So remember the brick mold. The door comes with a brick mold, the window comes with a brick mold, keeps the window or the door from going right through the frame. This is the part that you nail to, brick mold, right? You can actually buy windows without a brick mold.
And they're usually an insert window.
The insert, that's right.
And what happens with there is, some people years ago used to metal clad the old window when they disassembled it, and then they would put an insert into it without the brick mold, and they would fasten it. They would open the window and then fasten from the inside through the side into the framing. That way then you didn't touch the exterior of the window.
Brick molds used to be made of wood. It would be hard pressed to find one that's got
Yeah.
a wooden frame
You
these
can-
days.
You can buy wooden windows. I think Lowen still manufactures wood windows. Paramount does. Some of the higher end companies still manufacture a wood window. So if you're going for that look, say you're doing a heritage house, a log home or something, and you don't want the look of a white PVC window, you can buy the PVCs in many different colors now. There's getting to be a lot of companies that you can pick from a dozen colors that are available nowadays for PVC. Wood ones, they used to come clad, which had an aluminum sleeve over top of the brick mold on them, and they came with a myriad of colors there again that were available to you. PVC is probably about 95% of the industry now. You don't see a lot of the wood windows going in. We did make mention of the fiberglass windows here. I spoke on them. They're a higher end window, and they're usually in higher end homes. I see Darwin Window out of Winnipeg sells them, and now there's 2 or 3 people in Brandon that have started selling a fiberglass extruded window and that. So they are available. The window that I'm going to install is an awning style. I'm going to install it backwards here just so for visuals here.
Ask Dennis why he puts these two down before he puts the window in. Why does he want the window to sit off the sill rather than sit right on the window? To me, I'd said, all you're doing is creating an airspace in there for air to get in. Why won't you sit it right down there?
Got to be able to insulate all the way around.
You can't put anything in there if it's sitting right flat on the wood. And the insulation is a better seal than wood to wood. You'll never ever get it so that it's airtight unless you've got a space in there to put something in.
There are ways of doing it if you find that the window doesn't have enough room to go up or down. What I've used is a foam sill gasket that's used for the bottoms of walls. You could put a piece of sill gasket material along the sill and then insert the window, but make sure that it's pressed down so that it does compress the sill gasket slightly. That's one way of cheating if you've got a little bit of clearance problems that you're trying to get around in an old home. I found there's different ways of doing things differently if you explore other avenues. You could put a piece of fiberglass insulation down, have someone put a piece of poly on it so that when you put the window in, you slip the poly out and the insulation stays in there. It'll compress with just the weight of the window, but you won't get an actual good air seal. Before I would have put this window in, if it was an actual going on the outside, there's materials that go around the window on a new build. They sell material that's a sticky back that you would put along the window. If you've ever driven by new framing, you'll notice a lot of this goes right on the plywood on the exterior. That allows you then to put a bead of caulking down so that when the window goes in, it's sealed to this. And then when they bring the building paper up to it, they'll come up to here and then just tape it. And they'll use tuck tape, which is a construction material used. Most of it is CMHC approved, which Canada Mortgage and Housing. There used to be different types of it. Now they've gone to a grade that's blue in color. The red was pretty common for everyone to see for years. They don't like you using a lot of it now. Now they've gone to a, this is like Blue Skin. It's, Blue Skin makes a product, 3M makes products. Blue Skin is a brand name. Blue Skin, believe it or not, is used for foundation. It's for ICF foundations or wood, preserved wood foundations. It also works good in this application if you just cut it into strips. It's a much cheaper version of buying these flashings. These flashings can get quite pricey, as you know.
And they protect the frame.
Yes,
And you can have like 6 strips instead of 5.
yeah.
If anybody's ever taken a window out of an older home, you'll discover that this 2x4 that the window sits on is always rotten. It's always decayed. All the water runs, it collects in here because they didn't install windows back then the way we do now. Because this sill plate gets pretty bad. When you take a window out, that's the first thing you should check. This thing here probably should be replaced if it's black or rotten.
See, and I'm a proponent of black paper, which is construction paper. I always say to people, now with Tyvek, which is a woven poly product that they put on houses, a lot of people see it, they'll have the lumberyard's name on it. They're perforated to be able to pass moisture and air. If you ever take a sheet of it and look at it, up to a light, you'll see thousands of little perforations. And it's called air permeance. They're supposed to pass a certain amount of air through. And it has to do with condensation and moisture in the walls. It has to be able to pass it. I always said black paper was around for eons. How many people have seen a window pulled out of a 100-year-old house and the framing looks as good as the day it was put in there? And that was only put in with black paper. The trick nowadays, they used to wrap the black paper in around here, always to the inside. Nowadays the practice is to not, because when you spray foam, if the black paper's here and you spray foam this window, still ability for air infiltration under the paper. So I always say to people, if you're going to wrap it onto the sill, only come in 1 inch. That way when you spray foam, come back so that the framing, this foam, is sealed to it. There's less chance of you having air infiltration if you've spray foamed. Framing is exposed to the window. If you've put black paper or Tyvek and it's wrapped in through and then tied to your vapor barrier on the inside, you then have a chance of moisture getting in here, and if it's tied to your vapor barrier that's on the inside, where's it going to go? down inside the wall to your insulation.
Actually holds the spray foam away from it.
So that's why you'll notice now in building technologies, on the side of the building, they show it just comes up to here. They used to take it around like this and wrap it in. Not
Air and water seal. If you have leakage around your windows existing, you take all of the moldings and stuff off and you can see air. Spray foam is far better product than taking and trying to stuff pink insulation into that crack.
That used to be the practice for many, many years. And what I liken insulation to is a cigarette filter. You know, if you can pull smoke through a cigarette filter that's fairly dense, what stops air from coming through insulation? Basically nothing. It's designed to fill the void in a way that doesn't take on moisture, and that it's designed for in walls where you've got the framing that seals it to the plywood on the outside and still allows for air and moisture to pass out, but you have a vapor barrier, which is the poly that's up here on the inside. And that's why sealing it with acoustosealant when you do your poly on the inside is critical. I always have seen people use very little acoustosealant in homes, and if you go around with a thermal imaging camera later on, you'll see where there's air infiltration in homes. A lot of the air infiltration in new homes that are sealed really tight are your electrical boxes. That's where you'll notice the most air infiltration on it. Older homes, if you have someone come in and redo the electrical on the exterior walls of your home, the first thing you'll see them install is a poly box, and I think this one I did it with, and I should have showed you that before. The boxes are about that deep in there. It's a poly pan box that you take your electrical box, put in, and then fasten it to the stud. And the problem being is, yeah, they're great, quick for the electrician to put in, but most of them are designed for a 2x6 wall. So you have a 5.5-inch deep cavity. So you have the ability to get insulation behind that. If it's a 2x4 wall and it's designed, you lose the boxes that much further back. So it only has that much room to the back of the stud. That's all the insulation you're going to get back there. The practice years ago used to be to use the 6mm poly, wrap the box, fasten the box so that the poly was tight to the back of the box. So when the wire came through, it had that much insulation behind the box because you pulled the poly out, that sealed it with the acoustoseal. I'll actually, before we're done the course and that, and they get to the electrical section, I will actually take some of the drywall off and show you what I mean by that. Because it's a good thing to note when renovating, especially in a home that's 2x4 construction.
And it's important to know that if you have a building permit and you're doing insulating and the like, before you finish the inside of the wall, the insulation must be inspected, passed. Right? So just what Dennis is saying, there's so many little things that people miss when putting in the insulation that actually gives you faults in your wall where air leakage occurs, and they'll come and inspect, and they'll tell you that that's inadequate, or before you fill it all in, you need to have the insulation inspected, and I think that's something good.
And I was mentioning about using poly. This poly is always to be the heavy gauge 6mm. CGSB poly has writing on it, and usually if it's being inspected, they look for that on it. They will turn you down if you just use poly that isn't stamped.
Can't put saran wrap on the walls. You have to have
They're-
something that's a little heavier than that.
There's different versions of, some guys will sell at a lumberyard at just a heavy grade poly, but if you actually tell them what you're doing, if you are insulating, they will make certain that you have CGSB. And yes, there is a price difference.
What does it cost
CGSB, and it's 6 mil usually. All new homes are
6 mil.
the CGSB, and that's one, like I say, it's one of the first things inspectors come in and look for. What you're looking for in insulating when you're doing it is the same as with your windows and doors. You want the insulation to the warm side with no voids. Voids between the insulation and vapor barriers will cause you a world of problems because moisture comes to the warm side, and if there's cold in the wall, it starts to frost and free. If there's any kind of air gap in there, that's one of the most critical parts of a new home. You can have a beautiful new home, but if it hasn't been insulated properly, you will run into problems. The air gap under the window, I split the difference top and bottom. I framed the window opening in a haste one night. Double check your dimensions, 27 inches one way from 28, so I have a 1/2 inch air gap top and bottom. The window's 32 3/4, 34. So I got a little wide there. Now if you want, and you're on the outside of the window, what I would do in that instance is put a piece of 1x4 down there, 3/4 inch material. You can face it to the outside because your trim is going to cover it on the inside, or a piece of 1/2 inch plywood. I purposely framed the opening off size so that if you had to, at the kitchen sink and you're trying to jockey the window a little, you can actually adjust it so that the window and the sink are centered to each other. That isn't the sole purpose of it. It's to show you, though, that you can frame them off and fix it. If you put the 1x on the outside, put the window in, and then seal the window with your styrofoam, casing covers it here, you don't notice that when you framed it, it's off a little bit. If there's enough room on the brick molds, you can angle the fasteners and still catch it, so that when you foam it, it is covered. I'll install the window here, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Cordless drill I'll grab. I think I set one here. Very good.
This one is rotten? Yeah. It's a good job for your Sawzall. Cut it there and
Split the center
split the center,
and pull it out like that.
like right here, and you can just take it out in 2 pieces.
And when you go to put the new one in, cut it to width, take your cordless drill and a deck screw, put one at each end so that it sticks up, and you can hang on to it, jockey it down in the hole. You use the cordless drill and some screws. You'd hold it up a little bit in this corner, and then angle the screw in like this. And I would put 2 screws. And the same as you've noticed, there's a stud there. Just mark it, say, on the wall here and here. There's another one, and you just pop
Right here.
on each side. I've actually had a podiatrist in town here, and
Yeah.
he asked how he
How to
could
do
put a
that.
window between his wife's office and his office. And I explained to him on a napkin, basically, at the end of the course, one night, how to cut a wall without damaging anything, and how to cut the stud down deep enough. He blocked it in between, put the window in. He comes back the following week with his cell phone and a bunch of pictures, and he says, "Here, I did it. It worked exactly the way you showed us to do it." So there's different ways of doing things and applications for.
When the window is framed, when they're building the house, they have what they call a cripple that's right here and right here on each end of the window. No guarantee it is, especially if you're changing the size. But anyway, go ahead.
This one, I'm lucky enough, the window will catch on either side. If I jockey it, George is a pry bar. If he's on the other side, he would space the window so that the gap is the same on either side of the window.
That's a good idea.
Now I've left the shims here. You can pull them out after. That way then the insulation goes all the way around. You have less chance of having an air gap in here. Also,
It's not a really good insulator.
no, wood transmits cold. I also brought the level around. George is going to level the sill, and the guy on the other side with the drill has to wait and see.
Do I have to raise that up?
So,
Well, it should be.
yeah. You pick the longest line.
It's not like that, so you see, I have to
See, that screen has got a bow, so you can't do it there. Yep. I've got a screw in the top here. Oh. Well, no, I just didn't bite there. Just hang on. Screws aren't quite long enough to go through that drywall without biting. I'll grab a longer screw. Don't push on that window or it'll fall out. It's one of the nice things with having the screws with the ability to go on a heck of an angle. If you lose a little bit longer fastener, so it'll catch enough. So now that the opening is a little larger, if you get to where the opening is right within the quarter, you stay to that outside edge, and then if you angle them just slightly. It doesn't have to be a drastic angle unless, like I had with the framing on the outside here. The window's good and solid. You'll always
That's good. That's a
start
very
at
good
one
question.
corner or the other. Get the guy with the level to tell you when it's perfectly flat. Pop in a corner on each one and then fill all the other holes in that you've put in the window.
You know, if this was a big window, let's say it was 8 feet wide by 4 feet high, the number of screws that you put in here, all right? I'll let Dennis have that one.
You'll see on a lot of windows that come with a fin on new housing, they'll put screw holes every 6 inches. These don't require that many screws. As you see, these are about a foot apart. That's about right. On a window like this, you shouldn't need any more than that. I find on the corners I always keep them, a couple of them within that 4 inches from the corners. You can vary it. I like them to between 3 and 4 inches from either corner. You always want to try and keep it symmetrical. Don't go just throwing screws in randomly, because PVC windows have a tendency to want to do this and pull. They're fairly flexible. So if you put all the screws in at exactly the same points around it, you're drawing it in quite easily the same. You don't want to have it pulled in all different odd spacings.
And if it gets twisted or bent, this mechanism won't work very well. You want to make sure that you can do this with ease. If you get the frame twisted, it's going to alter the operation of your window opening.
This being a used window, it's actually fitting pretty decent. Another thing I often look for in a PVC window, because they're not as rigid as a wood window in that, the window can be racked slightly either way. By racking means to shift. Top and bottom can shift differently of it. I look around this when the window's closed and latched. Check that this margin is like our doors, that it's equal all the way around. So if George, if you close that window right closed and latch it, I think the latch on this side is in. You notice now with it closed, this one is actually quite equal all the way around. A PVC window, you can fasten the bottom or fasten the top. Once you've got the sill level, you can still move the top and bottom a little. You'll find anything with casement windows where the window opens like this, you can sometimes jockey them a little bit to make the margins proper so they open and close. The latches sometimes on PVC windows are adjustable. So if you get where the locking mechanism doesn't lock properly, that you've got to really lean hard into it. Sometimes there's a little pawl on the inside of the frame or the window that it locks into that has 2 screws. It's adjustable. So you can adjust some of them for the tension that's on them. If they have a crank that folds in, I always try and crank the window so that it closes, then undo the handle and move it so that it lays in the holder where it's supposed to. A lot of people crank them closed, latch them, and then back the crank up. I find then at least if it's wound to where it just closes and there's no pressure against it, holds everything snug in there, and the window is one more fastening point.
It always bothered me that building seems to make it more difficult for you than you. PVC means plastic, and yet you're talking about pipe, it's ABS, that's plastic. Why couldn't they come up with one damn acronym that meant all plastics? But PVC simply means a plastic window.
And it's the composition is different. This against ABS, which is designed to not be in the sun, this has UV protectants in the plastic itself. Otherwise, it would just oxidize, and there are windows out there that are getting old enough, they become very, very brittle. If you leave anything plastic out in the sun, the UV destroys it. How many of you remember your computer that looked yellow after a few years? That was directly related to the UV light. The plastics they used to use in them will deteriorate by the UV light. Anyone that refurbishes old computer gear, my son is one of them, he soaks them in hydrogen peroxide and it reverses the effect that the UV had on it. It turns them white again, but you have to treat it to neutralize it to keep it that way. PVC windows, after they're installed, you're all done everything and you decided, jeepers, I didn't want white maybe. It doesn't look right. You can prime these with a primer. The paint stores, I used to use I think I spoke about GP's plastic primers, and then you can paint them any color you want. So if you're trying to match an older home and you want, say, forest green on the windows, you can paint this. There again, you rough it up with a bit of sanding, just so that it'll take it. You use the proper primer on it, and you can paint it to match. So you maybe want to do one window at a time, and your house has got the green on all the other windows. You can do them one at a time as you can afford it, and nobody will ever notice it but you. So there are ways around things like that. We'll,
Would a person be advised to put caulking around here?
once you're, again, if you're going up against siding or stucco, you would do like, here you can see this window was up against cedar lap siding. So they fit the window in and then just go around it and caulk it. If it's a new install, you would have a drip sill up here. It's a metal flashing, comes down and out. If you're replacing on an older home, you can sometimes lift the flashing up enough to clear the window, put the new one in, and then just bring the flashing down. What I have done in some instances, if it doesn't come down properly, is put a small fastener in, a small short screw through the drip sill, and then caulk it. Use a good silicone exterior caulking. There again, Mono brand makes a very, very good exterior caulking. And there again, they can be bought in various colors to accommodate different colored sidings or stucco. And you would use either one of the colored ones or even a white one on the exteriors. There are companies that, like Mono and that if you go to Home Depot and look, lumberyards won't stock as much as Home Depot, but they will have a section with all of the various colors. So you can pick something that's reasonably close to what you're looking for.